Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today at this meeting. I'm Dr. Tim Williams. I'm Head of Interventional Research within the Clinical Practice Research Datalink, or CPRD. And I'm going to be talking about how we use electronic healthcare data in the UK to help deliver clinical trials. So I've created 4 learning objectives here. My aim is to help everyone learn about the Clinical Practice Research Datalink itself and the data as a resource for public health research. Learn about the research profile of CPRD, learn about how CPRD supports clinical trials recruitment activity, and also learn how CPRD can support pragmatic trial management and delivery. So my first question is, what is the CPRD? So I'll give you a bit of context. CPRD is an organization that has primary care, anonymized primary care data, which it collects directly from general practices throughout the UK. We are part of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, the regulator in the UK. And we collect data that we collect from primary care into a research data set that can be used for observational and interventional public health research. As I said, it's a database which is used for observational and interventional research. Now, traditionally, CPRD has been used and historically has been used to undertake observational research, such as epidemiological studies and drug safety research. The services are based upon, or the data is based upon 30 years of collecting longitudinal primary care data from general practices within the UK. We have a cohort of practices, and they all have consented to provide their data to us. The patients within the practices are made aware of this through notices put up within the general practice. And of course, in the UK, every single patient has the ability to opt out of any data flows, and that includes ours. We do research, we provide research services, including data and commissioned research studies for working with academia. We work with government, including our own parent organisation, the MHRA, and of course industry, the commercial pharmaceutical organisations. And many of them use our data for research purposes. We've been collecting data, as I said, for over 30 years. And we have now a database with 60 million patients in it. That's 60 million patient lives. Now this comprises of over 16 million currently registered patients. So these are the patients who are currently on the practices, our practices, active patient lists. And the remainder of the patients relate to patients that have previously contributed to data within those practices and have either transferred out, moved away, moved into another practice, or potentially have died whilst within that practice and obviously no longer available in the active patients. It's a longitudinal database. UK primary care is the gatekeeper. The UK general practices are the gatekeepers to the NHS data, and all data from all parts of the NHS and elsewhere flow back into the primary care record. And every person in the UK has, or nearly every person in the UK is registered with a general practitioner. We have over 10 years of follow-up for the median over 10 years follow-up for all of our practices, and it's 1 in every 4 practices in the UK contribute to CPRD. The data is representative in terms of age, gender, and socioeconomic status, approximately 25% of the UK population, and we get data collected daily from the practices that contribute data to us. The data that we receive from practices is just the coded data. We don't receive any patient identifiers. We do get data, we do get year of birth, but we don't receive date of birth. We receive gender, and we also get information on consultations, but only coded information on consultations, and we don't receive any free text. Information as it may contain identifiers. We've got data on over 14 billion consultations, and the consultations will variously include diagnoses, symptoms. These are coded using SNOMED codes, drug exposure, which includes products, product names, active drug substances, dosages, and dosage instructions. Referrals, where primary care is referring out to other parts of the healthcare system. A record is made of that. Any laboratory tests which are undertaken or asked or ordered from within primary care, the results flow back into the primary care system, and we can access those there as well. And importantly, over the last few years, obviously, we have always collected vaccination history on patients. And in the case of COVID, where vaccinations weren't occurring in primary care all the time, we managed to work with others to ensure that the vaccine records, including adverse reactions, flowed into the general practice record. And that's been very useful as we've been working with our colleagues in MHRA, drug vigilance and safety, to look at the safety of the vaccines as they were rolled out over the last few years. And we also have demographic data. Aside from primary care data, we're also able to link our patient data to other sources, and so individual patient linkage. But as we don't have any identifiers, we have to rely upon a third party to do this. This is the trusted third party, NHS Digital. They have this. We do it under a CAG approvals, sort of like a confidentiality advisory group as part of our data governance within the UK. This gives us access to hospital episode statistics, including inpatient care records, outpatient data, A&E, and imaging data, although not images themselves. We have links to ONS death registration information, so we have death, date and cause of death, and we have links to cancer registries. And over the last few years, we've been able to link to COVID information held by the NHS Digital. We can also link at the lower super output area within the UK to small area data sets, allowing us to link patients to many factors, including socioeconomic status and ethnicity scores and things like that. CPRD has got a long history of observational research, and it's had a significant impact upon public health. The sorts of studies that are undertaken, as I alluded to earlier, are drug safety studies, drug utilization, disease epidemiology is another big area, incidence prevalence estimations, and healthcare delivery, but a whole range of other areas as well, including health economics and so on and so forth. Over the years CPRD has been available, we've had over 3,000 publications associated with our data, and some really important ones as well. So, for example, CPRD was used to assess the safety of pertussis vaccine in pregnant women, done by colleagues within the agency, to ensure that undergoing vaccination in pregnant women was safe. a number of years ago now, but CPRD data, or GPRD data as it was then, was used to help debunk the link between MMR and autism, and also it's been used in various other drug safety signal assessments, such as the one between antidepressants and the risk of fatal and non-fatal self-harm at the beginning of depressive episodes. Over the last 3 years, obviously, CPRD has been useful, especially with its links to COVID data sets. Has been useful in understanding undertaking research on COVID-19. And here is a list of studies which were done directly using CPRD data. And of course, we also, as I mentioned, worked with NHS Digital and our colleagues in the MHRA to ensure that vaccine data, along with adverse event data, which was captured at the point of vaccination, was all flowed through a route into primary care data, which was then made available for the agency to help do their assessments on vaccine safety. So that's the background for CPRD, what the CPRD is, and its historical sort of a focus on observational research. But I talked about being used for interventional research, and it's a relatively recent development, but we are now looking at ways in which we can use the primary care EHR data along with our linkages to help support clinical trials. And I'm going to be looking at two things in this area. One's how we can support recruitment, and the other is a role of electronic healthcare records in so-called pragmatic trials. So why do we want to do this anyway? I mean, what's wrong with the way that we recruit to clinical trials? Well, it is difficult to find eligible patients. Studies often, or trials often, fail to recruit to target. About 50% fail to recruit to target. 80% of them are delayed. There is quite often an issue relating to loss to follow-up, and pretty much all clinical trials need some form of amendment at the time. And there's also the issue that really what you're doing with clinical trials when you're collecting specific data associated with your trial outcomes, you're duplicating effort, because a lot of this information is recorded in the patient notes, and the patient notes, or the patient's EHR record, is essentially the source data. So there's these issues which make it worthwhile investigating whether we can actually help, and in this case looking at recruitment. So the traditional ways of recruiting broadly fall into these categories, and there's sort of two broad categories where you are having patients self-refer, and you can in response to adverts or sort of like information being sent out. Now you can have print advertising, such as in local newspapers, or you can use more modern techniques such as social media, Twitter, Facebook, things like that, using access to groups of sort of connected individuals. Now, there is no clinical evidence, there is no clinical information to back up this self-referral. It's patients simply referring themselves, and most of the time that's acceptable. But you are not necessarily targeting your population very, very tightly. You're also not necessarily reaching out to a really big population, but it's a popular way of looking at recruiting. When we consider sort of like looking at some clinical targeting or clinical information to try and target patients, there's pretty much two options. You can go to known clinicians. So often organizations have a group of tried and trusted clinicians who they will go to repeatedly Now that's fine, and they have a very good understanding of their patients and their sort of like clinical situations and their suitability for trials. However, they may have access to a limited pool of patients, and it's not the very sort of like it's a relatively narrow field of vision for sort of recruitment. Certain clinical research organizations may develop local databases through their interactions with various trials and stuff, and they may gain access to these, so they're potentially sort of consent to approach type activities, which allow them to go back into the databases and approach people that have been interested in clinical trials before, perhaps. These databases are useful. They don't tend to be that big, but nevertheless, it's an approach that can be used. How can electronic healthcare records help? Well, CPRD have developed a service or a methodology which we're talking about, which we're calling CPRD Sprint. Sprint stands for Speedy Patient Recruitment into Trials. And from the icons, you can see that we envisage it to be a rapid approach to sort of recruiting patients. We see it as a highly targeted approach. We'll recruit recruit to target, given that we know the size of the pool of patients that we're looking to, and also we feel that it will be a more cost-efficient way of recruiting to these clinical trials. So what is it? What are the features of it? Well, there's essentially 5 key things, and we'll talk about them in a bit more detail, but we have access to a data set, and we can do rapid feasibilities. So the feasibilities may be looking at the top level inclusion exclusion criteria. So effectively what you're doing is you're using your MHRA data to model in inclusion exclusion for a study protocol, and that enables you to see sort of like quite quickly whether or not it's going to be viable in this population. So often that's extremely useful when you're trying to bid for recruitment targets within a global clinical trial. We know where these patients are. We know what practices they belong to, and we know where the patients where the practices are. So we can use that information to geolocate suitable patients. So if we have some recruitment sites and we want to find patients that are going to be close to that recruitment site, that's something that we can do. We can also target site selection. So conversely, we can see where all the patients are right across our cohort of practices and see where the densest population of patients, eligible patients for a trial is. And then perhaps it would be a good area to consider sort of setting up a recruitment center where you'll get more patients than if you go to an area where maybe there are less patients. Our model involves a clinical review as well. So we are basing our initial searches on EHR data, but it's just the coded data. And we have a clinical review step in there to sort of like really target this, the patient, the selection of the patients even further. And we feel that this results in only suitable patients being contacted, patients that are more likely to be suitable for the trial and therefore more likely to be enrolled in the trial. In a bit more detail, the process is this. We have 16 million patients. We have a cohort of 16 million patients, and we can model inclusion exclusion criteria. And as opposed to a quick feasibility, when we were actually doing a study, we can go into detail. We can look at using our knowledge of the inclusion exclusion criteria and our understanding of what sort of information you get in primary care data. We can build what we think is the most accurate query to run on the database. This runs across a network of 2,000 plus practices, and we can see total number of patients available throughout the UK. If we then have some particular sites, we can narrow that down to those which are the practices which are close to those sites within, say, 10, 20 miles or something, so that we've got an available population as well. Once we've selected the sites that we want to use and we've approached them and they've agreed to be part of this methodology, then the next step is to supply the GPs at those sites with a list of pseudonymized identifiers for patients. These identifiers can then be turned into actual patients within the GP's own system, and then they can undertake a clinical review to assess, again, a bit further the suitability of the patient for the trial, using some of the information that we don't have. For instance, they will have all copies of hospital discharge letters, referral letters, communications, things like that. They may have other things in free text notes, etc., etc., and that enables them to fine-tune the queries that we've already run. When they've agreed that these patients are suitable for being invited, they will contact them, inviting them. Now, this could be a letter, it could be an SMS, could be an email, and those patients are then contacted and invited into the trial, which is will ultimately result in them contacting a study centre. The bit in the blue box is the bit that we have control of. Obviously, there's a lot less control over whether patients actually respond to these letters, but there are things that we may be able to do in the future to influence that via the GPs themselves. So how it works in a schematic sort of way, so we have, let's say we have a particular site in mind, a recruitment site in mind, and we've got 6 practices around there. Now, the population of patients is represented by the grey figures here, and once we've run our query on those, we end up with suitable patients represented by a blue figure in this picture here, and the GP is sent these lists of patients, and they then contact them with an invitation as indicated by this blue arrow, and then they simply just sort of like respond by, ideally and hopefully, contacting the study centre, and they will be pulled into either pre-screening visits or questionnaires, screening, and then ultimately onto the trial, enrolment onto the trial. We have an ability to track these patients into this through a unique number that's assigned to them, and as long as that number is captured at the point of enrolment, we can see which patients have gone through this process right to the point of enrolment, and that enables us to recompense or make payments to GPs when they successfully enroll patients into selected patients that are enrolled into trials. Now, as I mentioned previously, CPRD is an anonymous data source, so we need to be able to do this safeguarding patient confidentiality. So this is all done with CAG, I mentioned it earlier, confidentiality advisory group, and REC approval. So the study will have REC approval. It needs to be clear that this is the method of recruitment that's being taken. The patient data that we look at is de-identified. CPRD only know where the patient is and not who the patient is. But the GPs themselves can then re-identify the patients at their practices, and that's the point at which the patient becomes identifiable. Now, identifiable data within the NHS realm, the GP surgery, is absolutely fine. That's what they need to see, and we don't need to see any identifiable information. So it makes the information governance a lot simpler than it would be otherwise, and so that's quite a nice, neat way of doing this. We mentioned about sort of geolocation. Well, it works in 2 ways, which we touched upon. So if on the right you can see the blue markers tell us essentially where the sites are. So we know where the sites are, and the red dots are the practices. Now, we can draw radii, circles around this 25 or 20-mile radius, and then we will only approach practices within that 20 miles, so that we're inviting patients who are relatively close to a recruitment site, and thus reducing sort of like travel. And we can do that with each of the sites, and that shows us what the total potential pool of eligible patients is. Conversely, we can map right across the country, and we can create what looks like a prevalence map. It isn't a prevalence map because it's not based upon the total population. It's based upon where our practices are. But nevertheless, it does take into consideration the prevalence of disease and also the distribution of our practices. But you will find that some places will have more potential patients, and that might be the information that you need to locate practices and locate recruitment sites in these areas. So you can use that approach to do it this way as well. So how do we maximize the potential of CPRD Sprint? Well, we're doing this in sort of like a pilot form at the moment. We've been approached by a lot of organizations. Some studies we think are going to be good for this model. Some studies aren't going to be as good. We're learning all the time, but these are the things that we think are going to be the sweet spot, if you like, for these sorts of trials. Phase 2 or phase 3, phase 1 first in man, you don't need to target those patients, so that's not really useful in this situation. We ideally want to recruit 100 patients. We've got a large cohort, and there's economies of scale in this approach. So the more that you can recruit, then sort of like the more cost effective it is. We've also been approached a number of times by organizations where they are really near the end of the study and they have not been able to recruit. But that's probably just because these patients are very, very hard to recruit, and it may be that we wouldn't be able to make a difference there, and it's not necessarily something that we would ideally want to do. We want to look at, we think it's probably best where we're looking at patients living and with diseases in the community, which is managed in primary care, such as a long-term chronic condition, and where the indication or the purpose of the trial is to sort of look at improving upon a current medication or an alternative to standard of care. So finally on Sprint, what are the advantages? We have a large database. We can geolocate at sites. We can do rapid feasibilities, which can be very useful to quickly and inexpensively find out whether actually this is going to be, easy to an easy sort of like ask to find these patients, and may help with sort of bidding for numbers of patients in global trials. We can target site selection, and GPs are able to, as soon as they've signed up and we've run the queries, they can instantly get these lists and they can start working on them immediately. The searches that we do on the database, we can run as frequently as possible. The data is updated as frequently as we want. The data is updated on a daily basis, so we could do it, say, weekly. This means that sort of like the list of potential patients is constantly updated. We also have the ability to tweak the search if we feel that it's not performing that well, and that will potentially help recruitment rates. The letters that the patients receive, or the communication the patient receive, are specifically focused on them and their conditions, and come from a trusted source. And we feel this is a very targeted approach to patient selection for clinical trials, and represents a highly focused recruitment process, which should be shorter recruitment periods with targets hit more quickly. Right, so that's our recruitment thing, and the recruitment component of it works the same for the next phase. It's the same principle. However, we have EHR data, and the EHR data is collected for these patients, whether or not they're in a clinical trial. So we could embed a clinical trial within an EHR data environment and use the data to follow up and look at outcomes. And this is the so-called pragmatic trials. We can support those, and we've got, I've got a few slides on exactly what we're doing in that area, and specifically on one of the studies that we're working on. So as a reminder, what are the challenges of conventional RCTs? We spoke about it a moment ago. 50% fail to recruit, 80% are delayed, most require amendments. And then there's the duplication of effort around collection of data, especially when EHR data is source data, and most of the information that you want, if not all of the information that you want, is likely to be in electronic healthcare records. To reiterate the paperwork, if we can have electronic technological systems, we have a platform that helps us to do all of our CPRD research services, and we can make use of that to manage the data from EHR and manage the recruitment activity, patient selection, and actually recruitment and enrollment, as you'll see. So there's a lot of paperwork that not only we don't have to duplicate because we're using the EHR data rather than CRF type data capture, but we're doing it digitally, and that will help reduce the burden. And by embedding low-risk clinical trials into EHR data collection, this is essentially generating our version of pragmatic trials. As I said, the recruitment process is similar to Sprint, but the GP is the investigator who then undertakes the activities of inviting, the same as Sprint, consenting the patient, enrolling the patient into trial. And the basis of follow-up for outcomes is electronic healthcare data. And you can see the advantages on this slide. As I said, we have a trial. This is a logical schematic of, we have a platform. This is a logical schematic of the platform. It's a collection of logical capabilities, essentially. There is a technological platform behind it. The Interventional Research Services platform. It helps manage the GP reviews, the invitations, and also enables the investigator to enroll the patient and randomize them to a particular treatment. It has access to the EHR data, so it can not only does the EHR data help to identify and target the patients to be recruited into the study, but it also serves as the data, which is then collected as follow-up data once enrolled in the trial. And externally to this platform, although it is possible to integrate this in collection of electronic patient-reported outcomes, and the data can flow into this conceptual platform. And within that platform, as well as managing the recruitment and enrollment, the data is collated and combined together. It can be pulled out for periodic monitoring. We can do safety monitoring. We can look at recruitment, we can monitor recruitment. All of these things can be done. And at the end of the trial, the data is there and can be converted into sort of like analysis-ready data set according to any data management and data analysis plan that we have associated with the study. In a bit more detail for a bit more practically, so in a generic EHR study, EHR pragmatic study, data enabled, You would we scan the database, looking at the in-X criteria. We generate the suitable patients as the eligible patients, as we do in Sprint. The GP then goes through all of the activities that's done in Sprint, send out invites either by letter or SMS or other mechanisms. And then the GP undertakes sort of like these activities such as discussing the trial with the potential participant, and then consenting them and enrolling them into the study as part of recruitment. Once they're recruited, the GP acting as investigator will access the randomization component of the platform, and this patient will be randomized to the intervention or comparator in this particular trial. Data is then collected from the various sources. This data is managed. It's managed according to data management plans, and then it can be analysed at the end of the trial. But then post-trial, official trial follow-up, data is continuing to be collected. So there's an opportunity to do post follow-up long-term analysis, and these are the activities that are managed on the Interventional Research Services platform. Now, if we make the interaction between the GPs and the potential patients non-visit based, then we also have no visits as part of the trial follow-up. So we end up with a decentralized trial. In fact, the trial that I will talk to you about briefly in a minute is exactly that. So if we think about the previous situation, we've got our 6 practices here, and we've got the populations at these practices. And within those practices, we've done the criteria and we've identified the patients at each practice who are suitable for the trial. Now, the GP has invited them already, and then the patient, the eligible patient, contacts the GP. Doesn't have to have a visit. This can be done remotely. And the GP then undertakes these activities, explains the trial, consents them, obtains e-consent, and then enrolls them into the trial. And then there is no need for any other visits to take place, because we're just collecting an MHRA data follow-up, which just proceeds for those patients from each of these practices. And that means that these trials are essentially totally decentralized. The study that I'm talking about, the study that is an example of this, is done in collaboration with Birmingham University and University Birmingham Hospitals, funded by NIHR. And it is a study that is looking at stroke prevention and cognitive prevention of cognitive decline in a broader community of patients, a younger cohort of patients who have atrial fibrillation. And we're using EHR data. The population, patients with current or previous episodes of atrial fibrillation with a low risk, low to intermediate risk of stroke or thromboembolism, but no current indication for oral anticoagulation. The intervention here is to anticoagulate them earlier than normally would be done, using direct oral anticoagulants. The control is the standard of care, so no oral anticoagulation until there's a high risk of stroke or thromboembolism, and the outcomes we're looking for: mortality, ischemic disease, and vascular dementia, things like that. We look at some secondary outcomes as well. There's health economic analysis going on, and it's a pragmatic EHR embedded study. This is how it happens in detail. We screen 13 million patients, not 16, because we're only using one of our data sets, which has got 13 million patients in it. The sites with the most patients are invited to participate. Now we don't geolocate because this is a decentralized trial, so we don't have to, so we can just take sites that look like they've got the most patients. We update the cohort searches for this study on a weekly basis, so the list is constantly being updated. The GP will access this list, do the screening as per the sprint process, and then invite the patient. If the patient then contacts the practice, then they go through the information, obtain e-consent, and enroll the patient into the study. And then via the RSP platform, they will randomize either to the intervention arm, which is DOAC therapy, and this is prescribed using the local clinical system, or the control arm, which is usual care. And then there are no visits in terms of follow-up, but what we do is we collect EHR data, focusing on which enables us to look at primary and secondary outcomes, and also technology-supported patient-reported data around cognitive function is undertaken. So an EPR on cognitive function is undertaken. The only other activity that the GP has to do is safety reporting, and so there is forms available within the platform which the GP can use to report safety SAEs. But of course, we've always got the EHR data, and we do regular scans of the EHR to look at any safety events, any SAEs that have been missed by the primary care. So it's a sort of like a backup. Thinking of it in terms of the Interventional Research Services platform, we have the database search. 60 to 70 years, these might change now because we've changed the study a bit actually. Clinical review by the GP, and the patient is invited. The remote consent is done via the GP. It uses REDCap, not our platform, although we will be able to do that in the future. And then the randomization is just through the system. So again, it's remote, and the prescription is issued either for intervention arm, DOAC, or control arm, no intervention. And then there's 5 years follow-up with EHR data, and PROs are regularly completed by the patients. So that's the Dare to Think trial. And finally, so how is this working? So how are we preliminary results across the studies? Well, as I said, this is really early days for us. It's launching these systems. We're learning rapidly all the time. We're understanding where the sticking points are in all of these systems, and we're rectifying them as and when we can. So these are the initial numbers. We expect these to increase as we go on. We have done 42 feasibility searches, and so probably up to about 10 of those look like they're going to progress into actual sort of clinical trial recruitment, or we have the 2 pragmatic trials. We've recruited 294 patients so far across 4 studies. When we go out to practices, 15 to 25% of practices sign up to the trials. The quickest sign-up turnaround in practices in terms of speed of getting up and ready is 24 hours for one practice, and they were able to start screening patients after 24 hours. When GPs review the eligible patients, we are getting average 62% of patients being invited from the list that we send. In some studies, it's up to 80%. We expect this to go up as we get better at deciding how to create the queries using primary care data. And in the Dare to Think study, once the letters have been sent, the enrollment rate is 17%. And I mentioned that we were able to modify searches, and we had one study which was performing particularly badly at identifying these patients, and there was a very high invitation failure rate, or a high proportion of patients not being invited onto the study from GP review. And we tweaked the search and we were able to increase that invitation rate by 27%. So finally, have we touched on the objectives review? So Clinical Practice Research Datalink as a data resource. Well, I've explained what's there, how the data that we link to, the size, distribution. I've talked about mainly the observational historical research profile of CPRD, but we've also looked at the fact that we are working on using EHR data in support of clinical trials, and we've looked at two specific examples of things that we're doing. One is clinical trials recruitment, and the other, of course, is support for pragmatic trials. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. There's an email address there if you have any queries. Otherwise, thank you very much.